You chose option A, to cross the flooded path despite getting cold and wet feet. To explore the feeling of this action, I've included clips from an interview I did with Nathan Penlington. Nathan is actually the reason I was ever called to do this project. Years ago, when I was 13, I attended one of his Choose Your Own documentary events, and this is what got me thinking in this format. In this interview, we discuss things like creative process and obsession. You were just talking a bit about your creative process and how you see being obsessive. One thing that I noticed from the book is when you were going through that process of almost trying to purge your obsessiveness about the whole Terence situation, that all went about in a very obsessive manner.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
like with the whole pilgrimage idea and everything.
It was, I mean, looking back, it's kind of madness now, but it kind of all made sense at the time. But so it's I'm kind of intrigued by format a lot, and I always have been,
Mm.
so whether that's like literary formats, um, books that where the chapters or pages have to be shuffled before you read it, or
Mm.
trying to think of some other ones now, or even the kind of cubist poets who would kind of use language in different ways and kind of, use typography in kind of interesting ways. Um, and that is very much using format to me. It's always been about format and finding the right format to tell the story in the best way possible.
Mm.
Um, there was a big difference between what could be put in the choose your own documentary show, um, because
It's a bit of an illusion. Like, I definitely think someone, if they put their mind to it, can master a few different things. I definitely am not one of those people. I am very much a person where I see myself as not particularly good at any one thing because I'm so interested and distracted by so many different mediums and methods and all this sort of thing. And I think the kind of person that I am in that way also links quite heavily to the sort of person that would interact with interactive choice-based media. Sorry, I'm just gonna plug this in here.
interestingly, it's popped up a couple of times in the last couple of weeks, but there's this idea of like 100 hours to get good at something. Um, and there's like artists on YouTube who've, if you do spend 100 hours learning to draw, you can go from being terrible to being pretty all right. Um,
Mm. Yeah, I do think as well that we're being less and less taught and encouraged to get good at a skill and a craft in terms of technical, creative things, especially in, I don't know what it was like when you studied art at university level, but for me and for all of the students that I know, there is a huge lack in technical resources, not in terms of facilities, but in terms of teaching people technical skills. And it's more about the concepts.
I think it was very much that then, um, which was a big disappointment. But in a way, I guess I was already kind of thinking across media and formats anyway. In terms of like you're saying about attention spans, um, there is a lot on YouTube in terms of like long form teaching of skills or visual art and stuff. And I think, with my oldest, we've been watching a lot of stuff that's really inspiring her to kind of,
Mm.
draw and make stuff. And it's not pitched at kids necessarily, but it's like the proof that you can go and make these things, you know. There is that you can start feeling that you can start comparing yourself to other people,
Mm.
you know, on Instagram or whatever it is, um, in a way that you wouldn't have been able to 15 years ago, you know, and it can that can also sort of mentally slow you down for making good decisions, I think, you
Mm.
know, because you're kind of looking at other people making work, but you don't know anything about their circumstances or when they've made that work or, you know, or anything else really.
Yeah. And I think the whole part of learning and getting good at something lies past the pleasure principle because it involves, really trying and actually allowing yourself to be bad at something before you could
Exactly.
ever get good. And I think that's also something that is decreasing in terms of our ability to do it. Decreasing in terms of our ability to do it. I need to find the text that I got this from, but I thought it was quite interesting. Previously and quite often, depression is seen as the inability to feel like the inability to feel pleasure and happiness and contentment or relaxation, those sorts of things. And what did she call it? What she was talking about was actually what she's seeing more in UK youth is what she calls hedonic depression, where we almost, um, a lot of people in our generation almost can't do anything but chase the pleasure principle, and that is all about distraction and convenience and all that sort of thing. Um, so that's becoming more and more prevalent, and I think that is a real antithesis to being able to try almost.
Spend a lot of time, speculative time making
Yeah.
or researching or whatever it is, and it may or may not end up
Mm.
anywhere. Um, but they're the, you know, that's part of the process, really, isn't it?
Yeah.
You know, and Choose Your Own documentary, it was hadn't setting out, had no idea where it was going to go.
Mm.
I mean, me and the filmmakers had sat down and we'd made a kind of very rough, like, flow.
We have relating to how we were raised, the life experiences we've had, all these sorts of things. Um, a friend that I have said that he doesn't have the ability to hate anyone because he knows that if he had been born in their shoes and had those life experiences and similar things had happened to them, that he probably would have acted in the exact same way, which I thought was quite powerful.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, but that was something else.
But yeah, no, I think all of these questions around kind of the idea of freedom of choice are really interesting. And I think as humans, though, I think we're quite lazy, you know, in that our brains are wired to try to take the kind of take shortcuts all the time.
Mm,
And we will go for things we've chosen before or things that don't demand kind of any process, really, you know. Um, like quite restrictive constraints was that he would allow chance to invade at one point in the work. He said it was a key conscious decision to
mm,
have one element of chance in amongst this highly kind of rigid structures that he would use to write his novels in. Um, I think that's kind of interesting in the idea of chance must be present in the creative process somewhere.
mm. And also, I think restrictiveness as well. It's
Yeah,
strange how, yeah, restrictiveness and discipline and rules can almost, yeah, open up freedoms and possibilities that wouldn't have been had before. I like it's those different responses that you get from people as well. Just like, I don't know, I wouldn't feel comfortable not seeing all of the work that you've done. Um, but
But
yeah,
that is a type too. I mean, that's, there are completists who play games till they've got 100%,
mm,
finish on something, when other people will just play it for the story or read it for the story or whatever it is. So
yeah,
it's good. That's good to play with those.
mm, yeah. What would you describe yourself as? Because I think I remember that you described yourself as a completist and obviously an obsessive by nature, but then also also
Yeah, I mean, I
remember you saying about how sometimes you struggle following and finishing one thing because you find a new obsession.
yeah, I mean, I guess I'm a completist once I get into like a that kind of find that I've really dug into an area. Um, but I think my process of making stuff is it tends to expand like ripples. It kind of gets bigger, and there'll be another
Mm.
ripple there with this one.
Yeah, one of my questions is, did you notice any interesting human behaviors through touring around with the Choose Your Own documentary? So, for example, I noticed some quite interesting behaviors and comments from people about the reluctance of having to stick with one path and not being able to go back and see all the other options. Because part of this project is I had a parody actually of a choose your own adventure book on a plinth with some really mundane situations that caused them to either open an like A, B, or C. And some people just couldn't stick with it. Yeah.
Yeah, so I think very early on, um, when we took it up to the Edinburgh Fringe Festival, and there were a couple of reviewers who'd come in to see it and refused to believe that there would be the multiple choices were real and that anyone would go to that much work
Mm.
to make this kind of branching narrative piece. Um, and I think in the design of it, I guess as soon as we'd been performing it for a week or so, and the audiences were coming out and chatting, or and realizing how different their show was compared to someone else's. Those
I
kind
don't
of
know.
like um, doubts about the actual thing disappeared a bit. The big one, I guess, it was about people needing to know what the other outcomes would be.
Mm.
You know, so and because it was democratic in that it was the biggest majority choice, that you wouldn't always get what you wanted. You're kind of surrendering the narrative to the majority vote.
Yeah,
So
that's an interesting element, I suppose, when you put it in a group setting, because the choose your own adventure format is quite individualistic. It puts
yeah,
someone almost like on their own. I think I remember you touched on that in the book, the fact that both you and Terence found a real connection with it because it sort of felt like a bit of an escapism out of loneliness. And I
yeah,
suppose when you get a group of people together to make those decisions, it really changes some of the ways in which they interact with it, partially because you get that element of not getting what you wanted, and that's a bit reflective of life, and also because in group settings, because we're social creatures, we sort of look to each other to make decisions. And
And I think some of the human behaviors that we kind of made sure we didn't kind of emphasize were that the votes were anonymous as well, because it would have been so easy to single people out and say, "So what did you choose? Why did you
Mm.
choose that?" And I think that would have really changed the dynamic.
Also, do I remember there being an option where you didn't embark on a journey to find Terence at all?
Um, but there is one in there, yeah. and it never got chosen live. But if a majority audience had decided that they didn't want to find out what happened to Terence Prendergast, it would end the show like 25 minutes in.
Right.
Um,
So
my feeling was,
you would have obeyed that, would you? You would have
yeah,
just been
yeah.
like, right, that's
My
it.
feeling was like, if people have come to see a show that's about adventure and kind of going on a quest, and then the majority are like, no, I don't want to
Yeah.
do that. Um,
Mm.
yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting because something that I hadn't really thought about until um, I noticed in my own event that people kept getting the same two answers from my little interactive booklet. They kept getting either A or B. Um, and I was looking back through what I'd written as the first if you and the second if you. And subconsciously, I was writing the line at the top to be the more sort of courageous, often seen as positive choice, and the second one as the more retreating, pessimistic choice. Um, and I went back through it and I went through it in what I would like to see myself as, like the choices that I would like to imagine I would make, and then the choices that I would like be more likely to make in real life. And I got C, the one that no one really got for when I was being realistic. And
Okay.
it made me think about how um, when you interact with the books yourself, do you naturally choose the more idealistic and fantastical choices, or do you choose the choices that you'd be more likely to make?
Um, yeah, it's interesting that it's kind of a lot of wish fulfillment in Choose Your Own Adventure.
Mm.
Um, really. And the same thing I think was true in Choose Your Own Documentary. I think there was kind of um, although less obvious, but I think there was um, you could try and I don't know, you might not remember, but there was a love letter I'd written that was in the style of a Choose Your Own Adventure, and then you could go back and deliver it to the person now. Um, and I think people chose that through kind of their own vicarious sort of wish fulfillment
Yeah.
kind of. It is amazing that how it stayed with people. I mean, with you, for example, it's kind of you're like,
Mm.
ah, yeah. And weirdly, I had an email after I got your message. I sort of checking my emails, and I had an email from an 80-year-old retired teacher who had picked up the boy in the book recently, and she was like, "Ah, it just reminds me of how I used to be as a when I was younger." And I was like, "That is
Mm.
incredible," you
I
know.
think, yeah, I think from my own sort of like knowing the way that I am and being able to relate to a lot of what you say in the book, sort of leads on to another question. Would you say that choose your own adventure books attract a naturally anxious type of person, as our brains are seemingly wired to be calculating many different realities of a situation at one time? Because I remember, even though I was very young then, I was already like naturally the sort of person that would be thinking about all the infinite possibilities and all the different outcomes of every little thing that I would say or do.
Yeah, I think
Um,
you're right. I think you know the the original creator of Choose Your Own Adventure, Edward Packard, when we interviewed him, he said, you know, that there is a kind of personality type that they seem to really appeal to more. And I think you're right. I think it is kind of slightly more anxious people do already calculate those kind of possibilities, and because you're always like, oh, okay, what if I do that? If I say this, or I
mm,
should have done that. So I think you're right. Yeah,
yeah,
I think
it's funny because I've always described social anxiety to people as telltale games that
yeah,
are like heavily influenced by the choose your own adventure sort of format. Um, you've got like a time bar, similar to how you were talking about with the ABCD in the event, but in Telltale Games, most of the choices that you make are through dialogue. So you'll have these lines of maybe three or four different choices of dialogue. You're like, oh God, something that I say, like whatever I choose is going to lead me on a totally different path and I'm running out of time. Um, so it's
Just with
funny
the
because that's always how I've described it to people.
When I decided to open the door to doing my research project about ambivalence, I was scared that I would become a more fickle and existential character. In fact, I have, thankfully, become a less ambivalent individual. I achieved what I set out for once. My hope is that you will leave this video with slightly healed thoughts about choice. I, for one, have a better relationship with choice. Funny that my commitment to a project that's partially about non-commitment would land me with things like a job offer at a gallery or a sense of actually knowing what I'm doing. Though I still can't choose a good ending for this video, so I'll just leave you with these words from those famous children's books. Choose your own adventure. You're the star of the story.